The Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. As a reminder to members, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. Please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. And consistent with House Resolution 8 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that after my opening remarks, I'll hand the gavel over for the first part of this hearing. Today, our chamber will be remembering my dear friend and South Florida neighbor, our former colleague, Representative Alcee Hastings. Vice Chair Manning will kindly be taking over the gavel for me, followed by Representative Liu, while I go and pay my respects and honor his lifetime of service. I thank my colleagues for taking the chair. Subcommittee also will have a hard stop at 12:30 today so that Special Envoy Lenderking can get to his afternoon hearing in the Senate. So I will now recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we're holding this hearing on the ongoing crisis in Yemen, the second in our subcommittee's two-part series. Our hearing this morning will examine the political situation in Yemen and U.S. policy. It follows our March 11th hearing on the country's humanitarian crisis. The fact that two of our first four hearings in the 117th Congress have focused on Yemen demonstrates that this subcommittee considers it crucially important to U.S. policy and stability in the Middle East. Welcome back to Special Envoy Lenderking in your first public testimony in your current role. U.S. leadership is necessary to reach a comprehensive political settlement in Yemen. President Biden has clearly stated that America will play an active role in ending the conflict and focused attention early in his administration on policy shifts in Yemen. An important policy change is your appointment, Mr. Lenderking, as Special Envoy, as well as lifting the blanket FTO designation on the Houthis to prevent humanitarian assistance delays, reportedly meeting with Houthi leaders while imposing targeted sanctions on Houthis obstructing the peace process, and ending assistance for Saudi-led offensive military operations in Yemen. I support these decisions. I believe they're important steps towards securing a political resolution in Yemen. However, there is more that needs to be done to advance diplomacy and reduce the humanitarian crisis that prolongs the suffering of the Yemeni people. The Houthis' current offensive on Marib threatens to displace hundreds of thousands of Yemenis. Many of these innocent civilians took refuge in Marib to escape Houthi rule in other regions of Yemen. The Houthis must immediately end their assault on Marib. The Houthis also continue to violate the basic human rights of the Yemeni people, and they bear responsibility for obstructing essential humanitarian assistance. In particular, Houthi manipulation of fuel supplies and diversion of customs revenues, which, pursuant to the Stockholm Agreement, are intended for the payment of public sector salaries, have exacerbated the humanitarian crisis and undermined chances for a political agreement. Houthi military ties with Iran and attacks on Saudi territory, including the recent strike on a university near the Saudi-Yemeni border, are unacceptable and do not signal that the Houthis are serious in any way about peace. The Houthis have long claimed to be a legitimate political actor in Yemen, yet truly genuine political forces participate in dialogue and negotiation. To be treated as legitimate, the Houthis must engage in serious political discussion to resolve the conflict and bring peace to Yemen. A political solution and lasting stability also requires serious good faith efforts by Saudi Arabia and its allies in Yemen to ease the humanitarian suffering and end the military campaign. Pressure from the U.S. has been and continues to be necessary to elicit behavior changes from the Saudi-led coalition. After sustained pressure from Congress, including the disapproval of arms sales, Saudi-led coalition airstrikes have now killed fewer civilians than earlier in the conflict, but still continue to take innocent lives and cause irreparable harm to the Yemeni people. Furthermore, restrictions imposed by the Saudi-led coalition have significantly worsened the humanitarian crisis. The interference and impediment of commercial goods and humanitarian aid shipped to Yemeni ports have caused food insecurity, economic calamity, price inflation, and the collapse of public services. These measures do not interrupt the supply of Iranian and other weapons, especially given the establishment of the UN verification and inspection mechanism in 2016. We must press for an end to these overlapping restrictions that are not serving their intended purpose, in particular, Recent Saudi-led restrictions on fuel deliveries created numerous consequences for Yemenis who depend on fuel to meet essential needs like pumping clean water. And while I agree that truly resolving the humanitarian catastrophe will require the warring parties to reach a negotiated political agreement, it is completely unacceptable that the blockade persists. Ending the blockade should not be linked to a broader political agreement. That's why I joined with Ranking Member Wilson and Representative Liu to lead a letter signed by 8 members of this subcommittee, as well as Chairman Meeks, to Secretary Blinken last week, calling for an urgent end to these restrictions. In particular, Mr. Lenderking, there's been mixed reporting in the media on the U.S. approach to this issue. I hope you'll be able to set the record straight and clarify this aspect as well as others of U.S. policy during your testimony. Mr. Lenderking, as you know, this committee and Congress has many pressing issues before us. It's not often you see the level of sustained focus on Yemen with broad support that we have had here. It is not often that Congress passes bipartisan legislation overturning arms sales to a partner nation, and it is also not often that Congress sends letters month after month on a humanitarian crisis. We are watching closely. We want to be a partner with this administration to end this conflict. I also look forward to hearing about your recent trip to Germany and the UAE, your 4th international trip since assuming your role, your engagement with UN Envoy Martin Griffiths, the pressure you're bringing to bear on all the warring parties, and the path ahead for diplomacy and an eventual comprehensive political settlement. I thank you again for joining us today and look forward to your testimony. I now yield to the ranking member for his opening remarks and will hand the gavel over to Vice Chair Manning for the moment. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chairman Ted Deutsch, for this very important hearing. Last month, we heard from witnesses on what is the world's worst humanitarian crisis that continues to devastate the people of Yemen. The ongoing conflict has wreaked havoc on the lives of the Yemeni people and denied them the most basic human rights. The Iranian-backed Houthi rebels continue to obstruct and divert life-saving aid, violating international humanitarian law. Solving the humanitarian crisis should be the utmost priority in this conflict, but the conflict itself cannot be solved without addressing the regional threat of the terrorist regime in Iran. It is clear the Iranian-backed Houthis have increased cross-border attacks into Saudi Arabia of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, rockets, ballistic and cruise missiles, and with the most recent occurring Saturday, April the 17th. The Houthis conducted over 70 attacks against the kingdom in March of 2021, compared with 25 in February and just 3 in January. The Biden administration has praised Saudi Arabia's peace efforts and recognized that, indeed, Saudi Arabia is a long-term valued ally of the United States. In their campaign to capture the oil-rich Marib province, Houthi attacks on the coalition-backed government have intensified in their use of ballistic missiles and drones smuggled from Oman and the southern coast of Yemen. And analysis of supply chain data and specifications of weapon systems and parts point to Iran as a main supplier to the Houthis. Prior weapons that have been provided, which very clearly and boldly proclaim "Made in Iran" in English. It is increasingly clear that Yemen is becoming an Iranian proxy to threaten stability in the region. Reports indicate Israel has deployed Patriot air defense missile system in Eilat in response to threats by the Houthis in Yemen. Unfortunately, Yemen has become an increasingly partisan issue, but our national security interests are at stake in the conflict, and it's in our interest to lower the temperature and assist the administration in developing a durable solution. I was grateful to join Chairman Deutsch in a letter highlighting the humanitarian crisis and calling for a responsible end to the blockade to allow for the influx of humanitarian aid. We must not forget that the Iranian malign influence in Yemen, as well as the region, and U.S. national security are overreaching issues of this conflict. We must work together, and we must work to end the suffering. I thank our witness for being with us today, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I will now introduce our distinguished witness. Mr. Tim Lenderking currently serves as the U.S. Special Envoy to Yemen at the U.S. Department of State. He previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Gulf Affairs in the Near East Bureau and is a career member of the senior foreign service, having served in the U.S. embassies in Riyadh, Baghdad, Kuwait, and Rabat, and held numerous foreign service posts both domestically and internationally. Mr. Lenderking joined the Foreign Service after a career in the refugee field, where he held positions with the American NGOs and with the United Nations in New York, Sudan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Thailand. We so appreciate your being here today, Mr. Lenderking, and the subcommittee looks forward to hearing what you have to say. I now recognize the witness for 5 minutes each, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Lenderking, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you about U.S. policy on Yemen. The Biden-Harris administration has prioritized bringing about an end to the conflict in Yemen in support.
Mr. Lenderking, there we go. We lost you for a minute. Go right ahead.
I'm sorry, some of the audio that we're getting from your side is intermittent, so my apologies on that. When President Biden announced my appointment on
Okay, go right ahead.
Thank you. I'm sorry. When President Biden announced my appointment on February 4th, he charged me with 2 specific tasks.
Got a lot of work to do to fix the Democratic.
Maybe if the witness would stop his video, we might be able to hear the audio.
We're just taking 10 seconds to fix the mute problem.
Thank you. And we're going to ask staff to tell us whether we should stop our video. Would that help the issue?
No, ma'am, we do not need members to stop the video. We may need the witness to call in via telephone for audio purposes.
Okay, we're just going to take a minute to correct the problem.
And Madam Vice Chair, oh, never mind, you've already done it. Reset the clock.
I'd like to take credit for that, but staff did that, so.
As they do everything we take credit for, right?
Exactly.
We're working on a phone link with you. Our apologies.
Thank you. All right, the chair will call a brief recess while we reconcile these issues.
I think I'm back on. I hope people can hear me.
That was a very brief recess. All right, we're back on.
I'll do my best. I was just saying, and I hope everybody tracked initial lines, but when President Biden announced my appointment on February 4th, he charged me with two tasks: reach a durable solution to the conflict and support immediate steps to mitigate the humanitarian crisis. Since my appointment, I've traveled to the region 4 times to do exactly that, push the parties toward a ceasefire followed by inclusive political negotiations, and build international support for efforts to end the conflict. As a result, we have now achieved a greater international consensus on resolving this conflict than ever before, along with more proactive engagement from key regional actors, such as our European partners in Oman. There's been constructive engagement between the parties. The UN Security Council enjoys an unusual amount of unanimity on solving the conflict in Yemen. This consensus will be critical in pushing for and maintaining a peace process. As a result of this administration's focus on Yemen and sustained U.S. pressure, we have also seen Saudi Arabia and the Republic of Yemen government announce their support for a nationwide comprehensive ceasefire. There is now a greater acceptance that the Houthis will have a significant role in a post-conflict government in Yemen. The U.S. will continue to press the Saudis and the Yemen government to ensure that they are taking the necessary steps to resolve the conflict in a responsible manner and to mitigate the humanitarian crisis. More work is needed to get the Houthis to put down their guns and compromise for the sake of peace. They remain focused on continuing their military assault on the city of Marib. At present, this offensive is the single biggest threat to peace efforts and is also having devastating humanitarian consequences. For the past 6 years, Marib has been a haven of stability and a refuge for nearly 1 million internally displaced persons who have fled conflict elsewhere and have nowhere else to go. The Houthi takeover of the city is not imminent, but they continue to move closer to their goal of encircling the city, potentially cutting off a population of 1.8 million people, many of them already extremely vulnerable. Humanitarian relief organizations warn this offensive risks triggering a tipping point that would overwhelm an already stretched humanitarian response. If we do not stop the fighting in Marib now, it will trigger a wave of even greater fighting and instability. We are already witnessing this through increased attacks on other front lines, a significant increase in airstrikes, and more Houthi attacks on civilian and other infrastructure in Saudi Arabia than at any other point in the conflict. We must leverage the international consensus, including here in Washington, and the engagement of regional actors like Oman to stop the offensive in Marib, which is an urgent humanitarian priority. Let me turn to our efforts to address the humanitarian situation. There is no greater priority when it comes to Yemen. The level of suffering there is unimaginable. You've all seen the disturbing images and dire reports from inside. At least one Yemeni child dies every 10 minutes from preventable causes, and this war has gone on for more than 6 years. I think about this every day. The roots of this crisis are deep. At the beginning of the war, humanitarian leaders stated that Yemen after 5 months looks like Syria after 5 years, because the situation in Yemen was already precarious before the war began. And now the economy is collapsing, leaving families unable to purchase even the most essential goods. Humanitarian assistance is offering a critical lifeline for millions and helping to prevent a famine, but it will never be enough. Humanitarian assistance cannot restore the economy or repair broken healthcare systems. In fact, as long as the war continues in places like Marib, the humanitarian crisis will continue to deteriorate. There are no quick fixes. Only through a durable end to the conflict can we begin to reverse the crisis. In the meantime, we must do everything we can to mitigate the suffering. For that reason, I would like to state unequivocally that fuel must be allowed to enter regularly and unimpeded through Houthi port. The Republic of Yemen government bears responsibility to address this issue, and Saudi Arabia must not stand in the way of it doing so. Similarly, the Houthis bear responsibility for then ensuring that fuel moves freely throughout the areas under their control and for abiding by their commitments in the 2018 Stockholm Agreement to use port revenues to pay salaries of Yemeni civil servants, salaries that provide urgently needed purchasing power to households living on the margins. I have raised this issue at every opportunity with senior Yemeni and Saudi officials. The Secretary of State has raised this issue. Although four ships arrived last month and additional ships are moving now as we speak, it is not enough. I'm heartened to see a notable increase in the monthly flow of food into Hodeidah. March 2021 saw 446,000 tons of food enter the port, one of the highest amounts in 5 years, and 45% above the 2020 average. This too is not enough, but these figures do show the system can work with cooperation from the parties to the conflict and effective UN oversight. And I am proud that the United States remains one of the largest humanitarian donors to Yemen. The movement of humanitarian and commercial goods has consistently been a casualty of the Yemen conflict, whether it is movement of goods through ports, roads, and across front lines, diversion of commercial goods, or bureaucratic impediments to humanitarian assistance. Houthi obstruction of goods and aids has been particularly egregious, but they are not the only ones who have engaged in this behavior. These persistent challenges make the imperative of ending the conflict more important. Although we can and must continue to tackle these challenges one by one, after 6 years, it is clear that only by stopping the fighting can we durably address the obstacles to the free flow of humanitarian and economic activity. As you can see, the challenges we face are immense. Only through a unified international effort based on a clear, nuanced understanding of the situation can we hope to make progress toward reaching the goals I have outlined. All of you play an important role in that effort, and that is why I'm here today. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Lenderking. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purpose of questioning our witness. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I will recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we will circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. I will start by recognizing Mr. Connolly for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Manning, and welcome, Mr. Lenderking. Let me begin by asking, why do we have a special envoy for Yemen? There are lots of hotspots all over the world. Why do we pick Yemen to have a special envoy?
I think it's terrific that the Biden administration has selected a Yemen envoy for Yemen, given U.S. interests in Yemen and given the dire humanitarian situation which I've outlined. U.S. interests in Yemen include ending support any existence of al-Qaeda or ISIS on the territory of Yemen, preventing attacks against international shipping. Let's all remember that the Bab el-Mandeb is one of the world's primary shipping lanes, and there have been threats primarily by the Houthis against international shipping. And in order to achieve stability in the Middle East, Yemen should no longer be a source of instability that provides problematic behavior throughout the rest of the peninsula. And I think, Congressman, that is a conflict that is within the capabilities of the international community to resolve.
So, speaking of resolution, there are some observers who would have argued that the United States cannot really play the role of neutral arbiter in trying to resolve the violence, given our past support for the Saudi activities in Yemen. How do you, in your role as special envoy, how do you overcome that perception of the United States and that potential handicap in the work you're trying to do?
I think that the most important activity that I could do is defend U.S. interests in Yemen, and that's been something that administrations have sought to do, obviously without success up until this point. So I take as my foremost charge that I should be representing U.S. interests, not the interests of Saudi Arabia, not the interests of the UN, of the Yemeni government, or of any other party. And I think that there is, based on what I've seen so far, a very strong and positive reaction to the appointment of an envoy, and more importantly, to the reinsertion of the United States in this conflict. And I don't see any party being unwilling to engage with us to achieve a resolution, which I think is very important.
Have you in fact met with Houthi representatives?
In the past, and over the past several years, I've met with the Houthi representatives on a number of occasions, and I believe that it's important in my current capacity to be able to continue to do that.
Yes, but are they receptive to U.S. leadership, given the question I asked earlier about the perception that we're not a neutral party?
My sense is that the Houthis welcome a United States role in this engagement. And I think that's because they look to us to help manage the Saudis and make sure that the Saudis are playing a constructive role. We would be doing that anyway. But I also think that they recognize that we are a superpower and that there's no other entity that can bring international consensus together like the United States. I do see that starting to happen.
Do you believe that to establish that credibility, the United States should use what leverage we have on the Saudis to end the blockade, to allow humanitarian assistance to flow freely in a country that has been so devastated?
Absolutely. I do think that we should and are already using our influence with the kingdom and with the Yemen government to make sure that goods and fuel can move into the port of Hodeidah, and to make sure that all of the economic arteries in Yemen are in fact open. Borders and ports and airports, all of these vital economic arteries should be open and access should be unimpeded, and this is a core principle of our engagement.
Thank you. My time is up. You've got a tough job, Mr. Lenderking. We certainly look forward to working with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Ranking Member Wilson, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Manning, and thank you, Mr. Lenderking, for being here and serving as the envoy. What is the current status of Iran's support of the Houthis? What is the level of Iran providing them weapons, funds, training, other assistance?
Ranking Member Wilson, thank you. Iran's support to the Houthis is quite significant, and it's lethal. And in our view, it does not support the resolution of the conflict. We have seen thus far no real evidence that Iran wants to support a constructive resolution of the conflict in Yemen. So Iran supports the Houthis in a number of ways, through training, through providing lethal support, to helping them fine-tune their UAV and missile programs. And unfortunately, all of this is working to very strong effect as we see more and more attacks on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and potentially other countries, more accuracy and more lethality. So this is a great concern to us.
And thank you for citing the increase of attacks. As I mentioned, we had an attack by the Houthis on the citizens of Saudi Arabia Saturday. So it's so recent. And then, of course, the Houthi attacks this year have been extraordinary in their increase, because there were 70 attacks against the kingdom in March. There were 25 in February and 3 in January. And with that, against a longtime ally of the United States, a very valued ally, Saudi Arabia. And with these offensives, what does this do to put U.S. citizens, diplomats, military personnel, and contractors in the kingdom at risk?
It poses a grave risk to those individuals. And that's something that I think that and I'm sure the President, the Secretary of State have no higher priority than looking out for those individuals. And that includes the many American citizens who live and work in the kingdom and who have been vital to the progress that the kingdom has made on many issues. It includes our embassy and many official Americans who work there. It includes our men and women and contractors in uniform. We have approximately 70,000 American citizens living there. It is our greatest fear that Americans will be killed in a Houthi attack.
And thank you for raising that number. See, the American people have no idea how many Americans could be at risk with the extraordinary increase in attacks from the Houthis by Iran into Saudi Arabia. So thank you for raising that issue and point, because the American people need to know. Additionally, your appointment as special envoy has been representative of several steps that the administration has taken to resolve the conflict. In your opinion, how has U.S. action since January changed the scale of the military and humanitarian problems posed by the Yemen conflict? What additional steps, if any, will the United States take to counter Iranian weapon smuggling to the Houthis and protect Saudi territory from further missile attack?
Yes, I do think that U.S. engagement so far has been decisive. It hasn't led to a ceasefire, which is something that I think we, and especially the Yemeni people, need to see, because the ultimate humanitarian act in Yemen is a ceasefire. All the other components I've talked about are vital as well, the economic arteries, the ports. It's the end of the fighting that will create the platform that humanitarian work can really go forward unimpeded. With regard to Iran, again, I think we would welcome Iran playing a constructive role if they are willing to do so. We have not seen any indication of that. That leads to the heightened scale of attacks that you have highlighted, the threats to Americans, and it leads many people to conclude that the Houthis believe there is a military solution. And I think the Yemeni people will be the greatest victims of that approach. So what we must do is build that international consensus, which I think we have really started to rally through U.S. leadership, and channel that to change Houthi behavior and their approach to the conflict.
Thank you for recognizing what a catastrophe a Houthi victory would be. And also, what has been the role of the United Arab Emirates?
The United Arab Emirates is a key partner for us in Yemen. As you know, it has reduced its military influence there through drawing down its troops over the last 2 years. They remain a vital counterterrorism partner with us and with Saudi Arabia. They're very effective at neutralizing al-Qaeda and ISIS elements, which still take advantage of ungoverned space and the chaos that exists in Yemen. So I do think that we will rely on them to continue to play an important role. They've played a significant role in the humanitarian space as well. That's why I went to the UAE on my last trip just last week to talk to them about ensuring that their influence remains supportive, constructive, and that they are continuing to focus on the humanitarian side as well.
Well, thank you for working with UAE, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Wilson. I'd just like to inform the committee that due to continuing technical difficulties, the witness will continue to appear by audio only. Mr. Cicilline, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Manning. Thank you, Mr. Lenderking, for being here. I think we were all pleased to see the administration create your post and for you to get to work so quickly. You spoke about your contact with the Houthis over a long period of time. And, you know, when you look at how much territory they have taken control over, and a huge percentage of Houthis now live in territories under Houthi control, what you know, their public statements have not reflected a sense of kind of a willingness to be part of a peace process. So what is your assessment of Houthis' core objectives and their willingness to reach a reasonable political compromise or agree to a nationwide ceasefire ultimately?
Thank you. That's a question that we ponder a lot, and I think that the answer is that the Houthi movement is somewhat divided. I think there are elements that are supportive of the kind of engagement that we are encouraging, and don't necessarily see a military solution. But what we see on the ground is different. I mentioned the continued assault on the city of Marib. It's in northern Yemen. It's a vital stronghold and the last stronghold of the Yemeni government in northern Yemen. It has oil pipelines and oil facilities that we know that the Houthis would covet. And then their cross-border attacks have been continuous. Ranking Member Wilson said have even increased in the last 2 months. So what we see in some of the constructive engagement is not matched by their behavior on the ground. And to that, I would add also the Houthis bear responsibility for obstruction of humanitarian assistance as well. That is a concern I know that is on the minds of many Yemenis.
Thank you. You spoke about your directly raising both with the Saudis and with the Houthi government the kind of blocking of humanitarian and fuel, both food and fuel, at the port, and your expectation that those blockades will cease. And I hope you will continue to raise that. As Chairman Deutsch mentioned, many of us joined a letter on this issue, and think this conduct is particularly egregious. And beyond the initial 4 vessels that you mentioned that were given clearance by the Houthi government, are there any indications that a number of other vessels which are awaiting clearance in the Red Sea will be allowed into the port to make their deliveries?
Well, that's very much our objective. As I said, I don't think we have any higher priority other than moving supplies, and that includes the humanitarian supplies, but also food and commercial supplies that are vital to the economic welfare of Yemenis. And I was very grateful to Secretary Blinken for his engagement on this issue through his contact with the Saudis and the Yemenis. I believe that was pivotal in getting ships to move. As I mentioned, this is something that we track on a daily basis through our excellent team at the Yemen Affairs Unit in Riyadh. And I know that additional ships are moving, berthing as we speak. There remain additional ships in the coalition holding area. We want to make sure that those move as well. So I can assure you that I will be unrelenting in my engagement with the Saudis and the Yemenis to get that backlog cleared.
Thank you. And if you can find an appropriate way to keep us advised of that progress, I know it's important to all of us. And finally, Mr. Lenderking, there have been some pretty disturbing reports of Houthi abuses and very significant human rights abuses, including hostage taking, persecution of religious minorities, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, and politically motivated arrests of journalists and women who criticize their role in this conflict. What is the status of human rights in these Houthi-controlled areas, and particularly what restrictions do women face, and what can we do to be helpful in this regard?
Well, thank you for raising the human rights concerns, because I know that is important not only to us on this side of the ocean, but also to the Yemenis themselves who were victims of this. The human rights record in Houthi-controlled areas is very poor. We document it in our annual human rights reports. It includes a wide variety of abuses, intimidation, forced conscription. There are credible reports of recruitment of child soldiers taken to the front to fight in places like Marib. What we have to do is continue to document and call out this type of behavior. And I think, as the conflict goes forward, and if and as we are able to deepen our engagement with them to the ceasefire and move into a political process, I'm hopeful that we can also engage with them more directly on these issues. But it's incumbent also on international actors, I think, to do more to raise these concerns and keep them in the forefront of the international mind.
Thank you. And we, of course, want to be helpful in that regard, too. So please engage with us in that effort. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. I now recognize Mr. Burchett for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Hey, are the Saudis, are they open to beginning any negotiations with the Houthis?
Yes, they are indeed open to negotiations with the Houthis, and they have in fact announced on March 22nd their commitment to a ceasefire and to negotiations. Contacts have taken place. As I say, some of them have been positive, but we have not yet seen the Houthi commitment to a ceasefire, and that's something that we're really driving very hard towards. So I do think that U.S. engagement has really helped the Saudis understand the importance of resolving this conflict in a responsible manner, and you can be sure that my and our senior administration officials will continue to push forward on this.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. What can we do to better prevent the Houthis from receiving these weapons from Iran? Is there anything we can do short of physical troops in that, and you know, to help block that, or is there something else we can do diplomatically?
This is a conversation that I have frequently with CENTCOM, as part of this is in DOD's lane to help us patrol the waterways and use all of our resources to be able to identify, you know, illicit material coming out of Iran, whether it be illicit oil shipments or whether it be hardware for Houthi armaments. It's been, frankly, very difficult to intercept ships and expose them. There have been a number of successful cases in doing so. We need our international partners to join us in this effort. We need countries like Oman to help make sure that their border remains closed to any of this type of traffic from Iran. You know, the Yemeni coastline is extremely rugged and it's unmanned for much of it. It's difficult to get eyes on, you know, the Yemeni coastline, but we need to keep putting pressure on Iran as well, I think, to turn a corner to play a more positive role in the conflict.
Okay. Yeah. Prior to all the talks and negotiations between the Saudis and the Houthis, how frequent were the cross-border attacks into Saudi Arabia?
Well, unfortunately, the cross-border attacks are constant. And I talk to my embassy leadership out there in Riyadh on a daily basis. We review what has happened overnight. We look at the battlefield damage assessment. There's been a disturbing rise in attacks across the border this year, 150 cross-border attacks this year. And that's a combination of UAVs, missiles, probes, etc. And I get back to the importance of American citizens. We need to be able to ensure that we're protecting American citizens as well to work in Saudi Arabia. It's a very disturbing trend, and it's why we need to bring this conflict to a close.
Okay. What's the relationship between the Haiti government and the Southern Transitional Council?
Yes, the Southern Transitional Council is a member of the Haiti government, is one of the member parties of this coalition government. And, you know, part of our effort in Yemen with regard to the different parties that we deal with is to ensure that they are fulfilling obligations and roles as part of the UN, as part of the Yemeni government, and not venturing out on their own and freelancing. So we've had conversations, you know, with the parties to make sure that the STC continues to play a constructive role in southern Yemen.
Okay. Thank you, Chair Lady. Thank you, sir, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett. I now recognize Mr. Liu for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Manning, and thank you, Special Envoy Lenderking, for your distinguished public service and for the service you're performing now. Your presentation earlier stated that the United States would like to have the blockade lifted. So when did you communicate to Saudi Arabia that the U.S. would like to have the blockade lifted?
Well, that's been a constant point of communication that I have had, and again, the Secretary is engaged on this issue as well. I speak to the Saudis on a daily basis, and this is an integral part of that conversation.
Let me ask this another way: for approximately how long has the U.S. been trying to tell the Saudis to lift the blockade?
Well, we've really seen the greatest amount of impediment and restriction since May of 2020. So over the course of almost a year, but I would say that since this administration came in and took, you know, really shown a spotlight on the humanitarian situation, which is the main concern here, those engagements have really stepped up in the last couple of months.
Thank you for that. And what is the response from Saudi Arabia?
The response of Saudi Arabia has been somewhat positive. As I say, we have been able to, I believe, through our engagement, to move several ships. But as I've made clear, more is needed, and that is a central point that I and others make to the Saudis.
that the essential lifelines must be open and cannot be held hostage to other elements of a peace deal.
And what have been the consequences if they don't lift the blockade? Or what are the consequences?
I think that would be extremely disturbing, and I'm very aggressively militating against that prospect. I think the more engagement that we have and the more support we have from the international community, the less we will see these impediments as obstructions to the humanitarian arteries.
So let me ask it another way. If the U.S. has been trying to get the Saudis to lift the blockade since May of last year, and they still haven't done so, what makes you think they are going to do so, and why do they feel any consequences? Or have we conveyed that they're going to get any consequences if they continue to just not lift the blockade?
Oh, I cannot articulate what those consequences would be at this particular juncture, but I know that this administration has charged me and will take this responsibility seriously. I would also just point out that food has continued to move through Hodeidah port, so there hasn't been a blockade on food and other essential commodities. It's the fuel imports that have really been problematic, and that is more of a recent development.
As you know, the Biden administration is looking at going back into the Iran deal. As you also know, there may very well be negotiations to extend the sunsets. For example, if nothing happens, then in 2023, the ban on ballistic missile technology gets lifted by the JCPOA with regards to Iran. To extent there's going to be negotiations, do you think there should be negotiations on Yemen and telling Iran they can't fund the Houthis anymore?
I will leave, real analysis of the Iran track to my colleague Rob Malley, with whom I keep in close touch, but he's the one leading that effort. I would say that, again, to restate that thus far I haven't seen any evidence that Iran wants to play a positive role in Yemen. I do hope, as the special envoy for Yemen, that Rob Malley is successful in his efforts, and that as his efforts bear fruit, that we will see, as part of that, a better approach from Iran toward Yemen.
All right. The Biden administration has said that the U.S. is no longer going to support offensive Saudi-led military operations. Has that, in fact, occurred?
Well, I can't speak to that point specifically. I know that the president has made his position very clear, and I believe that there are discussions underway on that. What I'm really concerned about is to ensure that the Yemen conflict is not subjugated to any other additional factors, and that we're able to drive towards ceasefire.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Let me just ask this question again. Is the U.S. currently supporting any military operations of the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen?
I'm not totally in that information loop, Congressman, so I can't really speak to that. I do think that we need to make sure that Saudi Arabia is able to defend itself against the attacks that we've talked about. But my focus is driving toward that ceasefire so we can get out of this whole question of offensive and defensive weapons and remove one threat off the table.
All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. I now recognize Mr. Perry for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for the recognition. Mr. Lenderking, has the administration's decision to end the Saudi-led military offensive in Yemen, as reinforced by the administration's recent redeployment of Patriot missile batteries away from Saudi Arabia, has that complicated your negotiating position in the pursuit of a peaceful settlement, do you think? Or has that made it easier?
Not so far. I mean, what I do see in really regular and persistent engagement with the Saudis is working with them to exit the Yemen conflict in a responsible manner. And I think, again, we're seeing some progress. We take an approach of trust but verify. In other words, we need to see the commitments that the Saudis make are actually borne through and followed through on. And, I see some rays of hope, but it's going to take continued engagement to get there.
If the Houthis were to capture Marib, is there really any realistic prospect for a peace agreement that doesn't involve Houthi control over northern Yemen, or even perhaps more of Yemen than just northern Yemen?
We'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it. I think our efforts right now are really focused on building international consensus to convince the Houthis to stop the offensive. And so far, I have to admit, the Houthis have shown utter determination and commitment to capturing Marib for a variety of reasons. I hope we can convince them otherwise. It's Yemenis who are suffering as a result of their offensive. It's Yemenis who are being displaced. It's the humanitarian infrastructure for Yemenis that is being hurt and crippled by their continued focus on this offensive.
Yeah, I don't suspect they're going to relent. They feel that they're at the cusp of victory, and especially without our engagement on behalf of their adversary, I think that they're emboldened. Do you think that since their takeover of Sana'a, that Houthis have acted as the de facto government in northern Yemen, and they've, as I understand it, formed an executive authority known as the Supreme Political Council? You know, how concerned are you that the longer they remain in power there, their presence is legitimized and they become something more than the de facto authority? You know, quite honestly, I think the question at this point is just how likely is it that Yemen becomes redivided into two or possibly more political entities or states, if you will?
U.S. policy at this point is to press for a united and undivided and sovereign Yemen, and I think that's a very worthy goal. Ultimately, it will be up to Yemenis to decide, what they want to do, and we'd like to get to a point at which an inclusive political process could address such questions as those. We're very concerned by what we see after the Houthi takeover in Sana'a, and the way that the Houthis govern. Many of their tactics are undemocratic. As I say, we document them in the human rights reports. We talk regularly to humanitarian workers. We know of the impediments that the Houthis impose on humanitarian workers, including the United Nations and international NGOs, the harassment of aid workers, the blockage of aid workers to be able to carry out their projects and monitor, visa impediments that are placed on individuals coming in to do good work in Yemen. All of this does not sound to me like a government that is really devoted to or committed to the Yemeni people.
No, I would agree with you. And just to be clear here from my standpoint, I mean, is there any doubt in the administration that the Houthis are a proxy for Iran and that they are doing the bidding and the will of what I consider a terrorist Iranian regime? Is there any conjecture otherwise in the administration?
There is some grounds to view that while the Houthi-Iranian relationship is significant and it's negative, that the Houthis at various times have shown independent action. The Houthis themselves have conveyed to many interlocutors that they only, maintain a relationship with Iran because nobody else helps them. Well, when we get this conflict resolved, that will really test that proposition. And I think we need to see that borne out, because if the Houthis want to continue a relationship with a terrorist state like Iran, then that's going to bode extremely poorly for prospects for peace and security in Yemen.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to be taking over from Vice Chair Manning. And next we have Representative Malinowski. Representative Malinowski, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Congressman Liu and Mr. Lenderking. I'll start with just an observation. We see Yemen right now as a basket case, as a country ravaged by conflict, and it's, I think, helpful to remember that 10 years ago, when we were celebrating and hopeful about the Arab Spring, Yemen was at the forefront of the movement in the Middle East to establish more democratic and Western-oriented systems of government. A Yemeni activist won the Nobel Peace Prize 10 years ago for that work. And since then, this country has been ravaged by internal forces, the Houthis, with their brutality, and by two outside powers, Saudi Arabia and Iran, that have used Yemen as a battlefield and Yemenis as cannon fodder in their proxy war. An end to the war is not going to solve all of these problems, but I just can't see any way in which we can begin to address any of them until we see an end to the war. And so I'm very, very happy that that President Obama has made this a priority, that he's appointed you, and that he took the steps that he did early on in his administration to end support for the warring parties that we were supporting, particularly Saudi Arabia. I do want to follow on Congressman Liu's question to you, though, about our support for the Saudi coalition. Mr. Lenderking, obviously the president did announce an end to U.S. support for offensive operations. I think he drew an appropriate distinction between offensive weapons and defensive weapons. But I do want to ask you, does our suspension of support for offensive operations include support for sustainment of the Saudi Air Force? So not just the bombs, but the logistical support, the spare parts, the maintenance, much of which was provided by U.S. contractors during the years of the war. Is that stopped now?
Well, thank you for your points, and particularly your introduction about the dire state of things. And obviously, one point I would just make on that is we have seen flashes of unity and cohesiveness among the Yemeni people. I point to the national dialogue and just around the time of the Arab Spring, before the Houthis took over Sana'a, is a moment where Yemenis came together from different persuasions and different sectors of society under one tent, and we're on the threshold, I think, of achieving something significant. And that effort was thwarted, and many Yemenis speak very positively about that period. And I do think it could be rekindled. So getting to the point where we can get talks started, I think you have to leave it to the Yemenis and try to inspire them to seize the moment. With regard to the second question, or the second point, I think the president's been very clear about his intentions with regard to the Saudi-led coalition. And he's also given me a very specific focus, and that is to work on the political track in Yemen and to work to mitigate the humanitarian crisis. And so I'm absolutely focused on those two primary objectives.
Can I stop you there? I do think it's important for us to know and for you to know what DoD is actually doing, though. I mean, I've worked with a number of American diplomats who've had a similar role to yours, basically leading what should be a whole of government U.S. approach effort to end a war. And I mean, as the envoy, you've got to know whether DoD is providing the support that is absolutely necessary for the Saudi Air Force to be able to continue operations. There have been continued airstrikes. You mentioned that there's not a blockade on food, but there have been continuing airstrikes as recently as March on ports that are delivering food. I mean, do you know whether DoD is actually continuing these efforts? I mean, it's a critical part of your leverage in leading the diplomatic effort.
Well, I know there's a robust relationship, as there has been over decades, between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia on security matters, but I would have to defer to DoD for the details of the kind of issues that I think you're raising.
Okay. Well, I'm out of time, but I would strongly urge you not to defer to DoD. You're supposed to be leading the diplomatic effort, and I would ask that you get back to us after the hearing on the question of sustainment, whether that's included in the suspension. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Malinowski. Representative Stubbe, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The United States provided $630.4 million in total humanitarian aid for the crisis in Yemen in FY 2020. Secretary Blinken called on other donors, especially those in the region, to step up. Other donations included $430 million from Saudi Arabia, $244 million from Germany, and $230 million from the UAE. The clearest beneficiary is the Iranian-supported Houthis, who have seized hundreds of millions in food aid and medical supplies provided by the international community to address local famines and the health crisis. The conflict incident data provides evidence that the Houthis diverted food and medical shipments from humanitarian organizations for their own use hundreds of times. Tremendous support from the international community has created opportunities for manipulation, since both the Houthis and Yemeni government security forces have been implicated in stealing humanitarian relief for their own use. The very groups responsible for weakening the healthcare system and disrupting economic resources for their own political gain. How can the international community work constructively to overcome these challenges?
I think exactly as you have just done. You have laid out the concerns and the record bare. I mean, one could not disagree with what you have said. All of those charges that you make about the plundering of relief supplies, et cetera, problems in the pipelines, all of that happens. I would just not want to see that lead us to conclude that we should not provide assistance to Yemen. I do think that our assistance to Yemen is one of the largest donors, is keeping people alive. We've added on top of the $350 million that you've mentioned from the United States. We've added COVID assistance as well. I think the U.S. assistance is making a difference, and we're also incentivizing others through our example to follow through. I was very glad to see that Secretary Blinken attended the March 1st Donors Conference in person. He called on other donors to do their part, and indeed they must do so, and that is a strong theme of my engagements with the Gulf countries as I make the rounds.
Well, given the Biden administration is likely to lift sanctions on Iran that is inconsistent with the JCPOA, what is the possibility that this will embolden Iran to building their capabilities and increase their support of the Houthis in Yemen and their other proxies abroad?
That's a key problem that we confront on a daily basis through the support that the Iranians provide to the Houthis. We need to continue to call that out. We need to continue to sound out the fact that one of the leading combatants in the battlefield space on Yemen gets support from a terrorist regime. That is a matter of grave concern. And as I've pointed out, American lives are threatened in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia by these attacks. So we really need to push the Iranians to get on a better page with regard to the Yemen conflict.
Thank you for your time today. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Representative Vargas, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Mr. Lenderking, first of all, thank you very much. You come very highly recommended by everyone, and obviously listening to you today, I can see why. It seems like you do understand the issue, and you talk very plain. The Houthis are not saints. In fact, they're pretty awful people. The Iranians have their hands in this situation in an awful way, and they are a terrorist state. I think we all understand that. But at the same time, I think that you and we understand the human misery that's happening in Yemen. I mean, Yemen is a much larger country than many people understand. I think the 28 million people or so in Yemen. I have to tell you, too, I have great love and respect for Governor David Beasley, who I know you know, is the leader of the UN World Food Program. And I've talked to him a number of times about the humanitarian issues there. And at one point when the port was in fact blockaded completely, there wasn't food coming in. Now there is, but there's a problem with fuel. How can we help him in a plain way? I mean, I like the way you speak. You're telling it plain. You're not hiding things. Maybe a little bit about the military, what we do and do not know. But other than that, you speak pretty plainly. I'd like to know how can we help here on the humanitarian issue with fuel and other things to make sure we don't have huge famine and starvation in this country.
Well, thank you very much. And you mentioned David Beasley, and he is someone I've come to respect a great deal in this position, and someone whom I talk to on a regular basis. It's really important for my job that I interact with humanitarians and leaders of big humanitarian organizations. I also talk to people on the ground in Yemen to get ground truth. And I think that, what we've assembled is a pretty accurate picture of the dire situation there. So I think that, congressional engagement has been very, very important. The letters that you all have written recently to the administration, identifying problems and talking about support for the appointment of a special envoy, expressing concern about Yemen. I know that the actors in Yemen pay attention to what you all do. And I know that the Houthis will pay attention to what you say and what we do in response. So I do think that continuing to call out and publicize the urgency of the situation in Yemen is vital to my efforts. I think the more that we can do together to drive the parties toward a ceasefire is absolutely critical, and to push the parties toward open borders and open communications lines so things can get through to the people who need it most.
One of the problems, though, is the fuel, right? I mean, my understanding is that even though we have a number of articles that I've read, even though we have the ability to get food in, we don't have the ability to transport a lot of the food because there are no fuel for the trucks. In fact, there's large lines of these trucks just sitting idle because they can't get the food out into the country. Is that still the case?
It's improved. It's improved a little bit in recent weeks. Again, I think U.S. intervention has been critical in this. We got a report this morning from our team in Riyadh, drawing from information inside Yemen. It seems that gas stations in Sana'a and around the country have a certain amount of oil to move transport. Unfortunately, there's a very big black market trade in fuel. The Houthis control a lot of that black market fuel rate. They drive the prices up. They sell the fuel at inflated prices. This is something that needs to be taken in consideration when we look at the whole picture of the Yemen economic and humanitarian situation.
Well, you have a very difficult job, and I know you're trying very hard, and I'm glad that you're trying to end the conflict, because I think that's the most important thing at the moment. If we can help you in any way, let us know. As you probably can see from my comments, I have great respect for the United Nations World Food Program and for David Beasley in particular. I was very happy that they won the Nobel Peace Prize, but part of it, I think, was because they wanted to make sure that the World Food Program continued to work very hard this year in particular because of famine, not only in Yemen, but throughout the world. So if we can be of help, let us know. Again, we have great confidence in you and in David and others, even though we know you have a very, very difficult job.
Well, thank you, and I certainly share your respect and admiration for the World Food Program. They are a vital player here, and we work very, very closely together.
Thank you. My time's up.
Thank you, Representative Vargas. And now Representative Jackson will be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. And thank you to Special Envoy Lenderking for being here today. Really appreciate your time. As someone who served our nation for 29 years in the United States Navy and visited probably over 120 countries in my capacity as both military physician as Navy Rear Admiral, I've seen many similar war-torn, famished communities, so I understand kind of what this means. I applaud the Saudis' efforts to bring about a ceasefire, and I hope the Houthis will join the negotiation soon. I, as many members on this call, am deeply concerned about the role Iran is playing in supporting the Houthis. So something I'd like to ask about that I don't think has been asked yet is, can you speak to what measures the international community has utilized or trying to utilize to prevent Iran from supplying weapons to the Houthis? And do you have any recommendations for us as members of Congress on congressional action that we should take in this regard?
Yes, I do think that, again, the relationship between Iran and the Houthis has been a vital one to enabling the Houthis to become a major major military force and a very frequent attacker of the kingdom and other countries in the region, and to threaten shipping again in the global shipping lanes. We need to keep calling out Iranian supply of Houthis. We need to continue to, where it is appropriate, to designate Houthis who are involved in weapons trafficking or other illicit activity with the Iranians. And I think we need to keep the pressure on the Iranian regime to recognize that it is completely out of step with the international community when it comes to any peace effort in Yemen. So again, I would like to see the Iranians play a more positive role. I haven't seen any evidence of that. And the more that we can pressure, I think, Iran and expose the Iranians for the negative activity that they do with regard to Yemen, maybe that will help pressure them to change behavior.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Also, I'd like to ask, now that the Saudis have offered some concessions, I hope the Houthis will feel compelled to enter in good faith negotiations and bring an end to the conflict. In your experience, what types of pressure do you feel the Houthis best respond to? And have any actions led to significant concessions by the Houthis in the past that we should key on?
Well, I do think that the Houthis respond somewhat to international pressure. I think when there's naming and shaming in the UN Security Council, it's something that gets the Houthis' attention. We're working to solve a potential environmental disaster represented by the Sopper tanker, which is off the coast of Hodeidah and is filled with oil. It's been out there for many years and is in danger of breaking up or even imploding, and just trying to get UN inspectors on board the ship to do the job, to make the assessment, to identify what repairs are needed. The Houthis have obstructed that. And that's a disturbing factor because of what it portends, I think, for the economic lifeline on the seacoast there of Yemen. So I think the more we can call out in unison, and I would ask other countries to do the same, to speak about where the Houthis are out of step with the peace effort, where they are raising goalposts and raising the bar on ceasefire talks. Let us call them out and press them to do better, ultimately in service of the Yemeni people who are the ones who suffer from their behavior.
Thank you. Thank you, Special Envoy Lenderking. I appreciate your interest. Thank you for your time again. And with that, Mr. Liu, I yield back my time.
Thanks.
Sorry, Chairman, I didn't see you there.
No, that's okay. Thanks, Representative Jackson.
Thank you, sir.
I want to express my gratitude, Representative Liu, for your ably stepping in, and to Representative Manning before you. I really appreciate the opportunity to celebrate Elsie's life. And it's good to be back. And Mr. Lenderking, the reports of your testimony have been quite positive. So glad to be back for the final moments. And with that, I will yield to Mr. Schneider for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back. And Mr. Lenderking, thank you for your efforts, Special Envoy, your insights here. I'm going to go quickly because I only have limited time. But as you said in your opening testimony, this is an intra-Yemeni conflict and only they can solve it. But there are many parties to this conflict, the Saudis, the Iranians, the Omanis. I think the other point you made very clearly is that until all of the parties understand and appreciate that the only solution is the political solution, and they can't get anything better through military, it's going to be hard to bring the folks to the table. If I ask a basic question very quickly, can you briefly describe who the Houthis are, to the extent that they are distinct as an ethnic tribe, but also an ideology?
Yes, certainly. Interestingly, the Houthis are not a tribe or an ethnic group. They're really a movement that grew up in northern Yemen in response to marginalization and disenfranchisement and neglect by repeated successive Yemeni governments. And it's built around a family, the Al Houthi family. So many of the leaders of the movement share that same last name. Since that time, it's attracted more adherents through youth movements and other types of populist sentiment. and really sort of coalesces around agreements that they have felt for the Yemeni government. By the way, some of those grievances are valid. There has been marginalization of this group and its adherents over the years, but none of that justifies their approach, nor the way I think that the Iranians have, in a very short amount of time, armed and equipped them so that they are practically a
Mr. Lenderking, let me reclaim my time because that's where I ultimately want to get to. But so I asked the question because it does hold out the prospect that post-conflict there's an opportunity to reintegrate Yemen and bring it back together, but for, in some respects, the Iranians. So if you could, the Iranians have a stake in here, and they are seeking something that can only, in their eyes, be achieved militarily. What steps can we take to counter Iranian weapon smuggling, to try to lay the groundwork so that there is a political solution, that the Houthis see that the path through politics and the negotiating table is better than aligning themselves with the Iranians and the military conflict?
I would make a couple of points. The first is that we need to keep putting continued pressure on the smuggling networks that the Iranians use. And I know that our team out at NAVCENT, at the Naval Central Command there in Bahrain, that's their predominant focus as they patrol the waterways in the Arabian Gulf there, looking toward Iran. We did 3 seizures of Iranian vessels last year. We found weapons on board, extensive military equipment. We exposed it. We laid it out for the world community to see. We need to do more of that. We need to capture more stuff, and we need to display it, because the Iranians should not get a free pass here. Again, what they're doing is all negative, I think, with regard to Yemen. So the more pressure that we can continue to maintain on the smuggling networks through our military assets in the Gulf, through our diplomacy, I think that will ultimately help our efforts. And then we have to stress the point that the Houthis themselves have made, which is that they are not puppets of Iran, that they are not stooges of the IRGC. Well, it's time for them to prove that by coming to the negotiating table. That's the best way to get Iran out of Yemen.
100%. Is there, in your opinion, is there a prospect for a political resolution to the conflict as long as Iran stays active in Yemen?
I do believe so. I believe that Iran would continue to play a negative influence, but I think we have to forge ahead. And I think we have to keep in mind what's going on with the JCPOA talks. We want to see progress there. I hope that will lead to a better approach from Iran, but we need to drive forward with the parties that we have some degree of leverage over, who are in the Yemen space, and continue to push them toward a ceasefire.
Thank you, and I'll use my last seconds just to put an exclamation point on what you just said. We need to ensure that Iran never ever gets a nuclear weapon, but we also need to make sure that Iran's malevolent influence in the region is countered, because I do believe they are a threat to our prospects, not just in Yemen, but in Syria and around the region. So again, Special Envoy, thank you for your time today, for sharing your perspectives, and for the work you continue to do. I wish you only success in getting to that political solution. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Mr. Lenderking, I want to just follow up on your last point about Iran. You started to make suggestions on how to expose what they're doing, how to hold them accountable for what they're doing. Can I ask you just to elaborate a bit on that in a slightly more detail?
Well, I do think, as I say, that the more that we can identify products that are coming from Iran for the war effort in Yemen, which I think while you were absent, I talked a little bit about that, about the challenges of doing that. First of all, that the Yemeni coast is wide open and it's very difficult to patrol that. We have put some money into sustaining and building up doing training for the Yemeni Coast Guard. That seems to be a vital function for us. I would argue that we need to continue to support that effort. I speak from time to time with with the admiral who is running NAVCENT in Bahrain, and we know as we visited that facility together more than a year ago, in Manama. We know that they play a vital role in keeping an eye on the waterways. So, unfortunately, with only 3 seizures made last year, we need to up our game, I think, in that space. And I think our public diplomacy elements need to be more adept and more robust at shining the spotlight on the things that we find, because these are either dhows or other types of vessels that are loaded with weapons, and they are going to the Yemen conflict. Similarly, we need to continue to work with the Omanis, who share the long border with Yemen, shut that border down for products, for military products that are coming through, from Iran, and publicize these.
That's very helpful. Thanks. Let me ask you about the expanding the efforts that we're undertaking to end the blockade. As I understand it, the UN verification inspection mechanism. In addition to that, there are 3 other primary restrictions imposed that severely impeded the delivery of goods, and particularly of fuel. So the question is, does that verification inspection mechanism work? And why do the Saudis tell you that the evacuation and humanitarian operation cell continues? Speak to both of those, please.
Great, thank you. The UNVIM is performing a vital function there. The UN verification and inspection mechanism. It is there to help ensure that supplies that move into Houdeida port and the nearby port are appropriate. Provides a mechanism to ensure that armaments and other banned material does not reach the port of Houdeida. Now, that piece of it, I think, works quite well, and you wouldn't find any objection from any party, I think, with regard to that. Now, there are additional restrictions or bureaucratic impediments that the Yemeni government asked to see, which I think we are trying to discuss with the Yemeni government to minimize, or in some cases to waive, to ensure that the process is streamlined and more effective, to ensure that we're getting at exactly the problem you state, that there are no bureaucratic impediments to the movement of ships, whether they supply fuel or food into the conflict.
Please.
No, and you mentioned EHOC, and that's a mechanism that deconflicts humanitarian movements and also enforces approvals that are made by the Yemeni government. So that does provide another mechanism. I do think, though, the important point is that we're really pressing to minimize impediments, obstacles, move things as quickly as we can.
And finally, I understand just from the exchanges I heard and from the message I was getting throughout, today's hearing understandably has focused an awful lot on moving toward a political resolution and dealing with the humanitarian crisis that exists by focusing on the parties. But I want to just finish by asking about the humanitarian appeal. The UN humanitarian appeal is dramatically underfunded. It is only, I believe, last I checked, at 13%. The question is, why are the amounts so low? And can you speak to conversations that you're having or that we should be having with other international donors to increase their contribution to the humanitarian crisis that has really led us to focus on this issue now here in our second subcommittee meeting?
Well, you're absolutely right that when the UN makes its appeal, certainly in the last couple of years, they have not reached the figures that they have sought. And as a result, there isn't as positive an impact inside Yemen as there should be. I take it as a very good sign that the Secretary of State himself attended, participated, made an intervention in the last donors conference. It was very positive that Saudi Arabia and the UAE both came in with large amounts. We're very focused on ensuring that those pledges are dispersed, number one. And number two, as I've traveled around the region, I have talked to other donors who have assured me that when a political process emerges, they will be more inclined to support humanitarian and other pledges for Yemen. So I'm confident that we can go to other donors and say, we're getting something going. The situation in Yemen is changing for the better, and it's time for other international donors to step up and support that effort through their generosity.
Mr. Lenderking, thank you very much. I would note for you, for the donors, that the humanitarian crisis doesn't wait on a political resolution. It's the humanitarian crisis that is urgent, that requires action now. And in your conversations, and in certainly in our conversations with the donor countries, I think it's imperative to drive home that point. This needs to be a parallel track. You can't get out of meeting your commitments to address the humanitarian crisis simply by saying that it's just too difficult because there's a conflict. That's true. It is too difficult because there's a conflict. That's why we need to up the humanitarian assistance. So we have to delink these from the political process. I'm really grateful, Special Envoy Lenderking, for your participating today. I know you've got a hearing over on the Senate side. Thank you for recognizing the importance of the House by coming here first, as you should have. And to you and all of my colleagues, thanks for your participation today. We look forward to working closely with you, Special Envoy Lenderking, as we go forward, and we're grateful for your service.
Chairman Deutsch-Schenck, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I've enjoyed spending time with you and taking your questions, and I look forward to providing any further information as we go forward. But thank you very much for your support, sir, and for your colleagues. Much appreciated.
Thank you, and I thank all the members, particularly the leadership of my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Wilson. And with that, this subcommittee meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everyone.